Okay, so I think we are on live. Dr. Chris Pro, hey, hello. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever the time to all the participants. So I'm Oscar, sales director at Digitsole, and I'm here with Dr. Chris Pro. And today, Chris, we will discuss mainly you about evaluating footwear,
Yes.
the impact of footwear on running. So, Chris, the stage
Yes.
is yours.
So, thank you all for joining us and spending the time. And to those of you that will watch this in a recorded fashion, that is fantastic. And um, as Oscar said, so this is a recurring webinar, just to give a bit of an introduction. So it's originally intended to help people navigate through the analysis part of our Digitsole Pro system. So it's, it has an education twist. But you'll hear it's focused on the product because it's more of a training. But we get a lot of people that just come because of particular interest. And lately, it seems to be sort of building. And last month, we evaluated footwear on walking. And I believe it was Theodore who recommended we do the same thing on running. So that's what we're going to tackle today. So it's very much focused, like I said, on the specific analysis, but there are some metrics that I think other people are familiar with, and might provide some interest in the system if you don't have it, but hopefully it will give you an outline of how to evaluate the system, the analysis portion, and maybe how to implement that if you do have it. So down in the lower right-hand corner, there is a chat feature, and I'm going to type in there, hello. Whoops, if I can spell. And so you can write questions in the chat feature. We'll go to those at the end, just because it's a little bit easier for me to get through this. And you've probably picked up that I have the gift of talking, so so I want to make sure that we can get through everything. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've also I hope I didn't make this too complicated. But again, we've been getting some really good response, and I think this will probably work out well. I don't think it'll be too complicated, but let's see what happens. So the first thing, after we go through that little matrix thingy, I'm just going to cover a few slides, and the reason is I used the same shoes. So if you watch this from last week, I used the same shoes that I used on the walking analysis. I wasn't going to. I was actually going to use a different person with different shoes, but I thought this would be interesting because in the walking presentation, I did use some shoes that really weren't designed for walking. And, when I learned early on in my sports science and training career, there are footwear pieces that are dedicated to specific things. There's obviously some overlap, like you can wear some different shoes for different activities, but if you really want to maximize your performance, then that might make a little bit of sense. And then hopefully this was dangerous for me because I'm 1.8 meters tall. I'm 115 kilograms, and I had to do this on my portable treadmill, which has a short bed to it. So it was a bit of a challenge because being my height, that stride is kind of long. Okay, so the question is, does it matter, or is it really how the foot performs? And I've mentioned this several times, that some people are more concerned with how the foot is naked, or barefoot. And I agree. I mean, that's really important, because that's the essence of the mechanics of the foot as it moves through the various cycles. But I also view footwear as something similar to a corrective device. And, for me in clinic, sometimes we may just be changing some shoes to improve someone's performance, right? Because there are some different shoes and they have different characteristics to them. So I'm not trying to push my agenda on you at all. I mean, I'm just trying to present a way of looking at things, and it might be up to you to, sort of make a decision as to, how useful this information is, or, it may not change anything for you depending on the patients that you treat and how you evaluate this. I'm a really big John Wick fan, so that's why I have that in a lot of presentations. But so these were the shoes that we showed last time, and so the top is the New Balance, which is a low profile shoe, and then the middle one is a Nike shoe, and then there's an Under Armour shoe. So the Nike shoe is actually a casual walker shoe. The Under Armour is a dedicated running shoe. And then the bottom one, which I should have taken this off because this product just launched today, and this is the Ballaston Smart Shoe. So it just came out today. I think I've got a picture of it somewhere here later as well, which is also another dedicated casual shoe. So you can get just, and I didn't get overly scientific here, but you could see some of the differences in the heel cup and in the toe box, and they're all the same size shoe on the inside of how they wear, but you can see that the profiles are going to be different. Again, I won't get into a lot of the differences with regards to the upper construction or even some of the heel construction, but you can make some notes as to what might look different. And because we were talking about walking last time, this is something that really made a difference, because you can see that the midfoot here on this Ballaston shoe is at its widest point. And the interesting thing with that was there's no arch support in that shoe. So when we went through that process and looked at some of this information, I thought it was interesting. So brief reminder, and the reason I do this too is, even if I'm doing a running analysis on someone, I always start with a walking analysis. And it's not so much that I expect the shoe to perform exactly the same, because they don't. A running shoe may not be the best in terms of walking, but what it does do is it gives me some of this normative data that we don't really have in running, because there's so many aspects of running that are going to be influenced. So I did both of these tests on a treadmill, and we can see here that I was very consistent in the speed. In the Nike shoe, I had the greatest amount of asymmetry. All the other ones did pretty well and were fairly consistent. I actually had the largest cadence on this guy right here, the New Balance. And that makes sense too, because it actually has the shortest profile to it. So its external feature characteristics, they're not as long as these other shoes. And that's actually going to affect, some of these characteristics. And I know this is kind of difficult to see a little bit, but so I tried to split it up. But you can see here, and this is the AI aspect of our platform, where it shows us, what falls within the normative range, and then it tells us if it's outside the normative range and whether or not it's going to be higher or lower. So we see that most all of these fit into a stride. Now at 3 miles per hour or at 5 kilometers per hour, that's a little slow for my normal stride. And that's especially represented as we see, it's on the middle aspect, definitely not on the far aspect, but they're all normal. So the stride duration and the stride length especially shows a little bit short on these, and you can start to see this difference. I usually have about a 3 to 4 inch difference, between 8 and 10 centimeter difference in my stride length. I have some issues. I have some issues with my feet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And this is the gait line. Our gait line is really, characteristic of just some averages, and so I wouldn't, as we say, hang my hat on that. It gives me some guidelines as well as with this guy right here, which is the propulsion rate. But you can see that I basically heel strike and transition very close to normal. What's interesting is we see, the the best of the propulsions did occur with the running shoe. And I explained this a little bit, I think last week or last month, where that makes sense. Like that shoe is designed to be propulsive into that forward motion, horizontal translation. So, it does a pretty good job. Not that any of these are really far off. I know that the red throws people off, but these percentages are really small, as well as when we consider, what exactly is the value of propulsion rate. So here we look at my foot during the stance phase. So this first point is on heel strike, then toe down into foot flat position, and then heel lift, and then toe off. You can see that, I'm somewhat normal in the left foot in terms of pronation, supination. So if you're not familiar with the walking corridor, this green corridor shows us, based on all of the data, we have over 70,000 analyses, what's considered a normal trajectory during that foot flat position. But you can see that when I go from heel strike to foot flat, it's a very rapid transition. And again, from that shoe, that makes a lot of sense because of the way that shoe is constructed, right? There's no support in it, for the most part. And I mentioned I coach in those shoes when I'm outside on the field, so mostly I'm on my toes running around, and I'm actually okay with that. And you'll see when I show you the running data, that because I had to take such a short stride, I wasn't getting a really good midfoot contact on that. But anyway. And then we see the Nike, followed a pretty good trajectory. The Under Armour, which is a running shoe, which also second to the New Balance, has the least amount of midfoot, support. Well, and again, because we're not really getting into foot flat position for extended periods of time, as we'll talk more about when we look at that running. So I wouldn't expect this to be like that, And then I see the Ballaston. And so the Ballaston and the Nikes, those, remember, are two considered to be casual shoes really designed for walking. Well, it shows that they do a pretty good job. And so that's what I would expect from that. Foot progression angles didn't really change, as they should not, unless something would dramatically change, potentially my toe off. So the longest shoe is actually the Ballaston shoe. And again, it didn't really change any of those features. I just threw this in here because I've given talks on running and performance, and so some people ask for this. So if you want a copy of this, send us an email. But we historically, we don't have a lot of good data on predicting running injuries, for example, at least with consistency in the literature. But a lot of that is because it's always retroactive. It's kind of looking at injury data in general, in particular sports, where we may not have all of the complete mechanisms. So we do know that running speed dramatically does change a lot of the parameters and metrics associated with running. So we do know that, and that could potentially have an influence. It could induce fatigue a little bit earlier. It could change some of your kinetics and kinematics with regards to, especially your strike position, your strike forces, potentially, it should affect your stride length, cadence, and things like that. Do those things alter enough to create an increase in injury risk? I think it could, but you need the data, to show that. In other words, we need to see, some of these abnormalities, one of which is going to be asymmetry. And I've shown that in some of my presentations where, as you start to see an increase in asymmetry, like a lot of my earlier research, we looked at, asymmetry with regards to performance. So we at least know that when there's a dramatic asymmetry, it decreases your performance, right? You won't run as fast. You're not going to be as powerful and things like that. So whether or not that's an increased risk of injury, we don't really know with regards to running shoes completely anyway. And I don't know, that may be okay. I think it's more on that individual level for some of us clinicians, which is why it's fantastic that manufacturers come out with a lot of different options in footwear. And I mentioned last time, I have a pretty good collection of footwear, and why, depending on my purpose, sometimes I may go to a different brand. And so that could, relate to that. The future, I think it's going to be in data and in prediction models. And I think it's going to be, to us at that individual level. I'd mentioned this before, looking at the elite, and not necessarily we're dealing all with elite patients, or if you work with athletics, but studies showing differences in gait patterns in identical twins, and even at that extremely high level where that gap really shortens up. And so, I think it is potentially going to be at our level. And then, so something that I'm looking at with some colleagues is, because we're better at collecting data with systems like this, what is that relationship to some of those other metrics? And I just got contacted by a university professor about something else related to that, which is I think that only our system is capable of measuring is going to be foot orientation in certain characteristics. And so there's some interesting opportunities. And like I said, I'm skipping through this kind of fast. And so, at the end, what does all of this mean? Previous injury is one of the major predictors of future injury, which makes potential sense, but it also means that, maybe people aren't really fixing the problem. Running volume is another big one. We see that, that stress strain relationship and other characteristics. And that's also related to the intensity. Environment also makes a big difference. And sometimes people are environmentally predisposed to certain injuries. Like here, I live in New Hampshire in the Northeast. And so, our outdoor like running and triathletic season is in full bloom right now. And if you watch the Boston Marathon, it's crazy. It's different all the time. Like it was pretty cold and rainy this year. There's been other times when, it's been much higher temperatures and dry and warm. And then there's some again other individual factors which in the elderly, I know for a fact in some of our research that we've shown there is some better predictability to it. I talk a lot about asymmetry, and we'll do that in a moment here as well. And then I think the evolution and stress testing and following some of this data is going to give us some better opportunity. So I'm going to go back to this guy right here. And so I'm just going to check here for a moment. There we go. Okay. So these are the 4 shoes. So first I'm going to choose this first one. So this is the Ballaston shoe. This is that white one, very, very large footprint to it. Very large heel, very wide toe box, very wide midsection. It's designed as a comfort shoe, and I will say that they are extremely comfortable, which is pretty cool. So, you can look across here. People know, hopefully, that you can actually rename the analyses, which I thought was a great feature to make those changes. We've got 2 views. We've got the general and the details view, and so the general shows you the total time, the speed. So I needed to keep this consistent. I actually set the treadmill to run at 5 miles per hour, which is just over 8 kilometers per hour. But that goes to show you what happens in some of these portable devices and how much I'm near the end of the weight limit on something like that. So it definitely had an impact. And plus, again, the deck is pretty short compared to what I would normally run. So I couldn't run any faster if I wanted to because of your increase in stride length, and it was just too short. So it does show that I have a lower cadence. So in some of these metrics, it does give you some of that feedback. So the cadence is going to be based on the speed and the stride length, because we look at cadence in steps per minute. Now, if I was training an athlete, like this is one of the things that we would take into consideration, right? Because the performance-based outcome measure is being able to run a certain distance in a certain amount of time, and improving that performance is usually running that distance in a shorter time frame. So that usually means a faster cadence and or a longer stride with a reduced stride duration, which obviously has an impact on that cadence. So that tells me that, we could do something about that. What I also notice is when I'm evaluating well-trained individuals, like their cadence tends to be on the slower side because they maximize that stride length. And not to say I'm a professional runner by any means, but I do get out there and kick it up once in a while. So, but this is just because of the speed that I was running. So this top graph here, it's really simple and basic, and so this just shows me at 15-second intervals, which I think is interesting. And if we have time, I've shown this in the past that I show a 5 kilometer run. So I had someone who run a full 5 kilometers, and I can look at this data every 15 seconds, which is pretty cool because if I want to look at points within the first kilometer, compare them to points within that last 5th kilometer, then I can do that and see what seems to be going on. Is there fatigue setting in? And when fatigue sets in, what is that implication, right? Is it just that they slow down? Is their speed and cadence changed? Is there a difference in their stride length? Okay, that's good. But what about the asymmetry? And then some of those other characteristics that we'll look at here in a moment. So you put your cursor over that point and it gives you the specifics. Now, this is not free running. This is on a treadmill. So I would expect this to be very flat, right? But people running on different surfaces with different inclinations and things like that, it's going to be a little bit more variable. And if you're good at knowing the pathway, then you can actually look at very specific characteristics of the times that they were running. We see this is the aggregate. So asymmetry is the aggregate. It's taking all the steps that I performed, and this is an average. This is a mean. And so this is something that, again, we do have normative values for, so it's showing it's in red. And so the asymmetry characteristic here is specific to contact time or stance time, right? Which is the amount of time I would spend in contact with the ground. So this is showing you that I have an asymmetry. I spend 7% more time in ground contact on that right leg than I do on the left leg. So you need to ask yourself, well, is that the problem or is it the other? So sometimes we'll spend more time in ground contact because that's the problem leg, or it could be because of the other side. So for example, if someone has pain and in ground contact, it induces pain or discomfort, they're going to want to turn that cycle over more quickly. And so we would see a difference in ground contact time, certainly. And we'll probably see a difference in some of these other characteristics like stride length, swing, and so on. And then we look, and this is my strike pattern. And so what's interesting here is if it doesn't show a number, it means that I'm landing completely flat-footed. Now, remember that this is also characteristic of how the shoe is. And so in this particular shoe, it has a bit of a heel to it. And so I may be landing flat-footed, but my toe may still be slightly off the ground. Versus we show this one, I'm going to be rear foot contact. So there's a 12-degree orientation of dorsiflexion is a good way to represent that when I'm in heel contact. And then we see, the contact force, 5.2 kilonewtons and 4.4. That's about a 20% difference. And so that is different. Like I said, I mean, my gait pattern was a little bit different, but at least, all of these footwears will look the same. So is there a standard? Not really. We can attempt to relate this to body contact or body mass. It also will have to do with speed, right? Remember that with sprinters, for example, you want really high ground contact because that translates into greater ground reaction forces, which equates to greater horizontal speed, right? And so they're not equal in terms of looking at that. So sometimes it's, would be strange to see a midfoot, because that's why some people midfoot strike is to reduce ground contact, but yet I midfoot strike and have a higher ground contact, and I wonder why that is. Well, maybe we'll find out. So then I look at my stride length, and here's why, right? I have a higher ground contact, right? Because I have about an 8 centimeter difference in my stride length. And so that's fairly significant. Um, which one is supposed to be better? It depends. Usually the longer stride length is going to be more representative. And here's what's interesting too is when I do have that longer stride length, I have a more midfoot strike. And so, that's how I typically try to run. I don't typically rear foot strike, but we'll see some consistency in all of these. And again, it's the difference in, where I had to run to actually perform this. So 41% versus 45%. So again, we do see some differences. Now, what does this mean? Well, even aside from looking at the different shoes, what it does mean is that degree of asymmetry would have an impact on performance. And some of us would say, knowing what we know now and having this data, because we can probably, if we did this on enough people, because this has never been done before, just doing these sorts of measures on groups of people, including teams, because a gait analysis typically takes a very, very long time, but here I could do this in 3 minutes. And so I predict that this is going to give us some insight as to potential injury, right? Because basically what's happening here is I'm running like I have sort of a short leg syndrome, right? Especially on that right foot. Okay. Pronation, supination angles. So this is ground contact. I would just go right to the advanced, right? So we can see that we do have some information here with regards to the position. But what's interesting is we don't have any set position for foot position as we go through this running. And I say that lightly because some of you will say, well, we have a trajectory that we're shooting for. And if you're using the same system repeatedly, you might have that capability to do so. But let me just tell you, this pattern is the opposite of what I'd like to see. In other words, I would rather see a heel strike on landing out here somewhere, around negative 20 degrees. And then I would want to see this transition at between negative 10 and negative 15. So these are the exact opposite. And any of you that know this, or you're probably going, well, maybe you had the sensors in the wrong shoes. And I would agree with you sometime, but I actually checked it because I saw this and I thought, this is the opposite. But this is what that really wide heel cup did. This is what that really wide midfoot did. So that really wide midfoot, I mean, it did not allow me. And I told you earlier that there's no arch support in that shoe. And so this is what it did to me when I was running. Does this make it a bad shoe? No, just I wouldn't run in it because it's really kind of doing the opposite. And I'll show you, something here in a moment, and it's doing that on both feet, right? So you can see that I'm at negative 15. So what that means, the negative angle means heel inversion, right? Or some people refer to that as supination. And we've had this discussion before. Supination is a triplanar, forefoot activity. We're mixing that a little bit, right, to be honest. And so, what we're looking at is the transition of the foot in a shoe, which again, some people say, well, that doesn't matter to me. Well, it matters to me because this is a performance-based outcome measure wearing a shoe. And so this is, what I'm using to evaluate. These two thin lines on either side, that's the standard deviation. That actually looks good. And so you do want some degree of standard deviation, or what some people refer to as a covariance, right? That's a variability within a certain metric. And we want some of that, right? That actually allows us to respond to a changing environment. So we do see that I actually over here, I transition, onto that toe box on the first and second ray, to a fairly normal position. but it's at least strange here on my heel strike and here. Now, you have to be careful here too, because on landing, remember up here, at least on this foot, it was a midfoot strike. So is it really that bad? Well, I told you that I'd like to see between -10 and -15. So it's not that far off. So be careful, and make sure you note whether or not they're heel striking or midfoot striking, because that will matter, right? That's why we call it landing, is it's relative to how their foot comes in ground contact. Okay. So don't get too hung up on this. So yes, this does look like the typical opposite, even when I midfoot strike, but you could see that the construction of that shoe pushed me into slightly further supination, right? And on this side, again, it's not bad in the transition, right? But that heel strike is definitely going to be off. So now we can look at the details. In the details, it gives us the same graph. And what you can do is you can click on a point and a moment in time. And like I said, I may want to do this if I'm evaluating a certain moment in time, like during the first kilometer, or like in some patients, like patellofemoral pain syndrome. I find, they, even when they come in, they present to the clinic the first time, that, oftentimes they may not have any pain. And the reason they even came in is because it's limiting their ability to run, right? And that's the number one reason patients actually come in to see us, is it's limiting their ability to do something. Its pain got so bad. And so I give them credit. Sometimes they may wait a little bit too long. So now, whoopsie. So now I just clicked on a moment in time, and you can see that at that moment in time, I've got an 8% difference in symmetry, similar impact force, similar attack angle, my strike angle. We see my stride length here is about 3 inches or 6, about 7.5 centimeters. Stance time, 5% difference. And so again, it's just showing me the same characteristics that we already looked at. What it does is it puts it in a plot format for that specific moment in time, because some people want to know that. And people say, well, one time really doesn't matter. Well, again, I can look at multiple 15-second aggregates and see, how different it is. So now if I want to, I can actually do 2 points. And it shows you what time stamp that's going to be. It shows you the speed and your cadence. And then what we see here is the asymmetry. It shows you the strike pattern and the angulation. It also shows you the impact force, right? So again, all of the same characteristics. And so that way you can kind of pinpoint, when did things start going wrong? And if you look at, some of the individual characteristics over a moment in time, and you find some consistency, you could, visually sort of refer to that as a mean. Okay. We see strike angulation, again, a very similar pattern, as we're going through that. So what do we think? Is it a good shoe for me to run in? Probably not. It doesn't have enough characteristics that say this would be normal. And like I said, is it going to create an injury? I'm going to put myself out there and say, if I ran in these consistently, it probably could, just because of, at least in my practice-based evidence experience, I can't quote you literature that says that it's going to do that, right? At least not a significant body of literature. So click up here, practitioner analysis, and this brings you back to the list of events, and you can see that, it's populated a bunch of them. So I'm going to go to the next one. This is the New Balance. That was the black shoe with sort of that yellow orange. These are the low profile. So they use a Vibram sole to them with a mesh construction in the upper. So there's really no support. So it's designed not to be running, at least heel striking. I've run in them a lot. Like I said, I mostly coached in them outside on on the field. I do strength conditioning for youth athletes. So it never presented to me a problem. So let's see what we got here. So same speed, cadence is very similar. It's at 161 versus 160. Actually, the speed got a little bit faster because of why, I don't know. I probably wasn't spending as much ground contact time or creating as much friction between the deck and the belt. Pretty flat trajectory here. So I've got a 5% asymmetry. And here's what we call a spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you the end result right from the beginning. I kind of have this on all of my shoes because I like I said, I have some problems in my feet that get exacerbated, especially when you increase. So I've mentioned this in a couple presentations that I often do what's called stress loading. And so I'll take a patient and I have them walk or run at 2 different speeds to look at and potentially tease out some of that influence. Okay. So 5% asymmetry. And what we see here, -10, -12 degrees. I mean, it's very slight. And so these are basically rear foot strikes. Some people, maybe I needed to run longer to get into my groove, but I kept the same time frame to make this equitable in terms of evaluation. But you see some consistency here, especially in my strike pattern. A higher strike on the left than I do on the right. So again, I've got a slight difference. It's not as bad between these two. So what happened was I reduced the stride length a little bit on my left. I increased it a little bit on my right. So that seemed to shrink down that asymmetry a little bit. And that was reflected here. We went from 7% difference in contact to 5% difference. And let's look at my foot trajectory. So this looks more like that normal pattern, right? But it's still off because I'd mentioned that, I would love to see somewhere around a -20. If I was heel striking, if I'm midfoot striking, this is okay, right? And I was only at 10 or 12 degrees of dorsiflexion. So I was getting pretty close to that position. But you'll see here that I transition, into that midfoot position, that transition phase when my foot is basically in foot flat position. It's a very short moment in time between when my toes come down completely and my heel is about to lift up off the ground. Okay. So there, like I said, there's no support in those. And so I do transition into a more neutral position. I wouldn't call it overpronation because I'm still in a negative value, which means that I do have some slight heel inversion, right? And so I'm not really overdoing that per se, but I'm pretty close to neutral. And I would have to decide as the clinician and look at, again, some of these other performance characteristics. Like if this was a person that came in and had some knee pain, I would think about that a little bit and maybe consider doing something in that arch region if we saw that as a problem. The toe off position looks great. Okay. And to show that there's a difference here. When I don't have a lot of support, I tend to over supinate in this left foot. So this is normal for me. It's a dramatic difference between the two. But again, you would need to decide, at this position at -2 degrees, I would say that that's pretty good. At -11, I'm probably too far on the outside of that foot. So I'm not getting the most out of propulsion, but yet that was my longest stride was on that left side. So, we need to dig a little bit deeper in terms of what is going on and what I want to correct, based on this, because it's different than the walking. We don't have, as much data. So same thing, I can choose a moment in time to look at those particular characteristics, and they're fairly consistent. So there weren't any really large, outliers here that really changed that, because some people say, well, if you only ran for a minute, did you get enough data points? I would say no, not normally. I would like to run people for at least 2 minutes to get enough cycles. And like I said, if I have a runner who presents with patellofemoral pain syndrome, but I can't elicit their problem running 2 minutes, right? I have to get them to run about 2 kilometers, and then they're like, oh, now it's starting to cause a problem. Now we'll start to see some of that. So you may have to run people longer to actually get your data points, but I was making sure I had enough time to complete this. All right, so let's go to the next shoe. So I won't have to spend as much time on all the data points, but I'm just mostly going to highlight some of the differences. So we see the speed is fairly similar. Like I said, I'm on a treadmill. The cadence, we're down by 2 steps per minute. So here's interesting is now my asymmetry is well, it's kind of spot on. So that asymmetry went from, the first shoe we looked at, which was the Ballaston shoe, which was, plus 7% on that right side and 5% in the New Balance shoe. And then in this shoe, this was the Nike shoe, I believe. Yep. This is the Nike shoe, also a walking shoe for the most part. But it has some interesting character. I kind of call it a crossover between walking and running, but you can't lace it up. So I can't get it really good and tight. So I wouldn't run in them, but so it evened out here. Looking here, foot contact was very similar between the two, as well as impact force, right? So now that right foot increased in the impact force, and we got to wonder why. So I still have about an 8 centimeter difference between the stride length between the two shoes. And again, that was consistent. That was something that we did see. And let's look at this. Okay, now we're starting to look a little bit better here. So -16 on my strike, on my landing strike, and then the transition to -11. And then we see -11 to -3. And this is my feet, man. This is just how it goes. And so I think you've picked up on the fact that for running, I do wear some inserts to correct these problems. And so, but it's consistently shown in the different shoes. Some of them are going to be better than others. So, you may correct some of that simply by wearing a shoe. And I want you to think about this for a second too, because I was having this discussion with some colleagues yesterday. Because of all these, I've measured so many different shoes, and I do this with other patients too, that you can get some different outputs. Why? Because shoe construction, they give you some differences, and so that may make a difference. So when you're testing someone and you're evaluating them for, let's say, an insert or an orthotic, the shoe is going to matter. The shoe is going to have an influence on the outcome of that particular orthotic. I've shown that many, many times. And so that's why it's important that, I tell people, bring in some different shoes and let's see what you're going to be wearing and the impact. And sometimes we have to find a happy medium, or we have to say, don't really wear those shoes, sort of regularly. So again, just shows you the specific data points, nothing different or interesting here. So let's go to the last shoe before we run out of time. And so this is actually considered a running shoe. It's a basic runner shoe. I wouldn't call it a high performance shoe by any means. It's fairly light. It has a good cushion heel. It doesn't have a huge drop in it, which for me anyway, I don't like a large drop. For some people, especially if you're transitioning from a heel striker to a midfoot striker, that drop can be maybe advantageous in correcting something for them. But I typically don't like to use a large drop. So same speed, same cadence. We're at 4%, so there is a slight difference. Once you hit 3%, greater than 3%, it's something to think about. At 4%, I'm not overly concerned, but let's look at what we've got here. So I do see that I rear foot strike. It's only 6 degrees. So and people they look at the picture and they're like, wow, that looks a lot. It's just a picture. Look at numerical values. And so it's only 6 degrees. And this is more representative of my normal gait. I strike harder on that left foot than I do on the right foot. And we saw that at the beginning with shoe constructions that didn't have anything. We do see I've got the longest stride. So this does really well for that left foot. I have a much shorter stride. So we're looking at, 7, 6, 15 centimeter difference. So that's pretty significant, right? And so I got to take that into consideration, even if it's not for injury, from a performance perspective, right? So if I'm experiencing some issues on that right leg, then that would explain this, and we need to fix that. But again, some people present, you're dealing with performance characteristics and not necessarily, patients in pain. So you'd have to do a little bit more investigation. It could be a weakness. Maybe my plantar flexion is, maybe I've got some trigger points. I've got some weakness on that side. My dominant leg is my left leg. Do a single leg vertical jump. And that could be one way to potentially evaluate that. Do a single leg repeated vertical jump. And that gives you an opportunity to not only look at that characteristic of power output during takeoff or plantar flexion, but the ability to, as we call, load and explode, right? Absorb that energy and then turn that energy back around. Let's look at these characteristics. So this is pretty normal for my running, especially I'm very close to up here, midfoot striking in both of these. I'm okay with that. And that's why I don't see a dramatic change here. I'm right, about where I would want to be on that left foot. I'm not where I want to be on that right foot. I think if I was looking at this and I wanted to do something for this person, they probably need something to reduce that potential excessive pronation. And you may follow this up with, again, a walking analysis, a foot posture index, some of the other windlass, mechanism evaluation, some of these other effects to evaluate and see exactly what's going on. But at least from this perspective, I would say, yeah, it looks like they probably need something to support that arch on that right foot. And again, we saw that in this shoe, and especially the New Balance shoe with the walking tests. So again, we can look at some details and we can choose 2 different points. 4.2, 7% difference, normal. You know what? I really needed to take this out longer because there seems to be some inconsistencies here, right? And this first one at 15, this was just in the first 15 seconds, right? So this one may actually have proved to be a little bit more normal if I carried this out. And I'm going to cheat and say I know for a fact it would, because these are the shoes that I've actually run road races in, and they're the ones that I use for overall performance. And I've measured these with my inserts, and they do very, very well. Okay. So let's look at the evolution. That's another feature here. And you can look at this for walking, running, and jumping. So let's click on run. So these are the only 4 runs in there. So I've got cadence here. It's the same, right? I'm running on a treadmill. Stride length, you would think it would be the same, but it's actually a little bit different because of the sole length of the shoe can impact your stride length. And we see here in the middle. So this middle one is that New Balance. That's the shortest shoe. And then this is the Ballaston shoe right here. So we see the greatest difference in that New Balance. Like I said, I need to take that out a little bit further, but let's say you had someone running in the same shoe and you were looking at this evolution from the perspective as a result of your training or your rehabilitation. That's kind of how you would normally look at that, not necessarily from, looking at different shoes, but it's data. It just depends on what exactly it is that you would like to accomplish, with that. We do see that these Nike shoes, I had very equal stance time between the two. Again, that was representative. We saw an asymmetry of 0% in that particular shoe. The largest was in that Ballaston shoe. And again, it's a walking shoe. So I'm not used to running like that. and it's wearing something that you're just simply not used to. The next second lowest was in the Under Armour, right? But if I what I should have done is put my inserts in there and shown you this again to see the evaluation of the shoe and the inserts. I don't know, maybe Theodore, let me know. Maybe that's next month. So you can also click on the advanced, and the advanced gives you the attack angle, the impact force. So again, it's just showing you all the same information that we saw in the charts, but now you can look at all four together. You can also, I think what I didn't show, and I'll show this real quick. Oh, kicked me out. Is you can do a comparison between two shoes and or two events. In this case, it was two shoes, and you can put two side by side using this compare feature. Okay, those three dots, you can also export your PDF file. Right, so you can put two events side by side to look at the characteristics, and you can also export that that PDF. All right. So we've got a few minutes, so I'm going to look at some questions here. So again, down in that right-hand corner, you can either put it in questions or chat. I'm going to pull up questions here first. Oh, so I'll go to that next. Dan writes, will we have access to the presentation at a later staging, experiencing intermittent power failures? So this is recorded, so it'll automatically send you a link. It takes maybe 5 minutes after we're done closing down the session. It will generate a recording that you will have access to online. If you would email education.digitsole@gmail.com. Let me put that down here. That's one of our email addresses. Let me, just in case I screwed that up, let me put mine down there too. If you want to holla at me in person. All right, let me go to the top here. Ying writes, my question today is add a condition type, condition name, category, has very limited medical condition I can choose. Could we add a patient's condition by ourselves? So there is a drop down menu that allows you to put the condition in there. And then I didn't show it very well, but in each report, there's a section for comments. And so right after I take an analysis, I can put that in even on my mobile device. And you can also do it in the online application that I'm showing you here with the computer, because it gives you a little bit more information. So yes, you can add a patient's condition on your own. Is it better to test at their own tempo or well, yeah, it's a wicked good question. It's for me, it's both. One is I did a presentation a few months ago, and I showed their tempo and where they wanted to be. They were struggling to improve, and so they wanted to get better. But whenever they tried to go beyond their normal tempo, they were struggling. So we had to evaluate that and see where the problem was. They had an increased ground contact time on that one side. So I like the idea, Theodore, of doing both of them, because one is it shows me what they seem to be comfortable at. And then, like I said, sometimes I'll do a stress load. And that stress load usually means running faster, or If they're really abnormal at their normal pace, I will actually sometimes run them slower and see if the speed changes that, because maybe that might give us a little bit more insight. Ying writes, my patients couldn't walk on a treadmill. A lot of patients can't, right? Unless you, it's a very strange, what we refer to as a perturbation. It creates a lot of balance issues. They have some harnesses. There's a really inexpensive product out of Colorado that it attaches to any treadmill. It's actually designed to reduce their body weight. And then, of course, there are treadmills like Boost. Boost is a really cool treadmill that also you can literally control that. My data collected from treadmills has a big difference. Yeah, I mean, it again, it depends on what you're looking for, but absolutely, because one of the things that we found in comparison between treadmill and overground running, and even in stance phase, and that's why we have a lot of information that we collect in stance phase, because there seems to be that relationship. Differences certainly will include stride, but in the event I want to control speed, I want to control the environment, there's no better way to do that than a treadmill. My second option is sometimes I go out to the track. I will collect, patients or athletes that I'm going to be working with to we meet there at the same time. So that way I can also control the environment, because that matters too, the ground surface. Studies in older adult populations, whether they're walking on gravel, a tar surface, concrete, or grass, actually influences those values. So exactly. I mean, but here's what I can tell you is the values are characteristic for the situation that you're in. And so that may be a difference. I don't put people on treadmills if they can't handle walking on a treadmill. We will normally do overground walking if possible. But if I need to control an environment and, for example, have them at two different speeds, even runners that typically run outside, often in my environment, because in the winter we have a lot of snow, they're used to running on treadmills. Um, Force is the peak value. It is. It's the average of the peak value that is correct. So it's and a lot of people ask the question, well, how are you doing that if you don't have a force transducer of some sort? So we use an algorithm, and it's a very highly regarded algorithm that has validity and reliability to it. So we use a single peak contact point algorithm that's curvilinear, and it gives us the value based on the velocity and the acceleration rate as they're coming in ground contact with their body weight. So using appropriate body weight does make a difference. Theodore writes, I've done these tests with the same athletes in the same shoes. They gave different patterns. I presume fatigue. Yeah, and I think also, Theodore, that if they're not used to running on a treadmill and I test them on a treadmill 2 different days, I may get some different values. But that's why I think what I like about the running analysis is it gives me that opportunity to look at some of these different events. Like I said, sometimes I've been with people and we're running on the road where they normally train. So we get a really good, interesting characteristic that is different than when I tested them on a treadmill. And that's where, again, it can be important to make sure that we're the environment that best represents where they're performing, or if they have a problem, where their problem is. And so it can really make a difference. What I don't do is I don't really compare two different environment data if I'm looking for changes. In other words, if I tested them on a treadmill and I did some rehabilitation or some training, I then don't go test them outside and compare those two. I retest them in that same environment that I did before to make sure that we're getting some consistency in reliability. Ying writes, how about the Vibram 5-toe? I have those, and I thought about it. I was going to do that. I didn't, but I'll tell you what. I'll do that sometime, and I'll show you if it made a difference. I know it makes a difference because one of the things that happens um, is your toes actually have an influence. Like if you've ever run on the sand, and I don't want to go down that path, but yeah, it is a little bit different. I've read that motion control shoes that reduce the heel eversion mechanism limit the. Yeah, and that's a problem with some of these corrections. So I used to use something to control supination because I had a tendency to over supinate in both my feet. Now mostly it's on just that left foot, and now it's not because of being normal. It's actually I have a cuboid syndrome on that side, so it definitely affects um, the recovery mechanism. And so, the how can we test that? It's probably going to be related to their cadence and their speed at any given particular run, because you'll notice that you keep track of the distance. If they're running at 5 kilometers, what they were running at. You can do that shorter times too. But what'll happen is you'll see a difference in their typically in their stride, and in their ground contact time too, because as we influence that recovery mechanism, if there's too much absorption, they'll spend too much time in ground contact, or if that mechanism reduces propulsion, they'll spend I shouldn't say too much, but longer ground contact time. Typically people can make up for that in some aspects, so we may have to do something different, like in stride length correction, but that's going to be some training. Attack angle increases when the runner feels more comfortable with the shoe. It depends. If you are heel striking and you have a really nice cushion, if you're in a low profile shoe, then I think what's going to happen is, especially to it, you will see that ground contact angle is actually going to decrease, because now they've gotten more comfortable. Because remember, when you go from a heel strike, what we often see is that representation at the knee is the knee's going to be in greater extension, and the hip may also be in greater flexion, which is why we tend to see longer stride lengths of the same person running at the same pace, whether heel strike or midfoot. Midfoot striking, we will tend to see a typically slightly shorter stride, right? Because you're not reaching out as far, but you have less braking mechanism, but there's greater absorption. So we tend to see a lower knee extension position, as well as a slightly reduced hip flexion position. So that angle, after they start running and getting into your comfort, if they're heel striking, yes, it may increase because they're striding larger after they warm up. If they're midfoot striking, it hopefully is going to stay about neutral. What I find when they're midfoot striking, they're feeling more comfortable. Their heel, because no one likes to heel strike, with a long stride running at fast speeds, and so what may happen is it may stay about the same, or potentially even decrease. So yes, Rana followed it up and said, you will have access to this. And she talks about, so yeah, Theodore, I've been testing a lot of orthotics too. So that'll be something of interest. And like I said, showing you the difference in, that same shoe when I fix it. And that's why I do both. I look at people's shoes, because sometimes it's their shoes that may correct a problem, and I may have to correct a shoe, because the reason I care about how someone performs in a shoe, someone comes in, maybe that shoe's causing them a problem, and they say, I just spent, a lot of money on that shoe. We have to figure out a way to fix it if they can't buy a new shoe. So that's why I look at both of those things. So we're over time. I appreciate you all hanging in there till the end, and I look forward to next month. So we've got one coming up for next month. I hope this was informative. As Rana says, feel free, give us some ideas, and I don't know. I feel like I'm maybe making these a little more fun, but maybe they're too complex. But anyway, I think there's enough normal ones out there. We'll refer you back to some of those. But anyway, again, thank you all for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next month. I think June may be the last one before our summer break.
We will update in the next session,
Oops, what's
Chris.
that?
I'm saying that we will update regarding when is the last one in
Okay.
the next time. No
Cool.
worries.
Yes, and please stay tuned to our Livestorm company page. I'll put you the link right now so that you can see the upcoming webinars. Then we'll take a break for July and August, and come back to you with much better and more interesting topics in September.
Okay.
Cool.
Dr. Chris Proulx, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to get ready. I'm coaching little baseball players, so I'm going to head out to the field in a little bit. Wish us luck.
Good luck.
We're 0-2 right now.
Okay, good luck. And thank you, everybody, for your time, for your trust, participating in this webinar.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Bye.